China has cast doubt on a Wall Street Journal report that says it's planning to build a new military training facility in Cuba. Beijing denied knowledge of any such negotiations.
我不了解你提到的情况，我们希望有关方面把精力多用在有利于增进互信和地区和平稳定发展的事情上。
Well, the report has sparked alarm in Washington as Cuba is just some 160 kilometers off Florida's coast. U.S. officials say a new facility could provide China with a platform to potentially house troops permanently on the island. And they believe it could also broaden China's intelligence gathering. U.S. intelligence reports suggest that discussions to establish a facility on Cuba's northern coast are at an advanced stage. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Biden administration is trying to forestall the deal. The latest news comes as Washington is seeking to ease tensions with Beijing. And earlier, CNA's Glenda Chong spoke with Raffaello Panucci, senior fellow at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and he told us why Washington is concerned about having a Chinese military facility in its backyard.
Well, I think clearly, the United States is at the moment expressing itself in terms that it sees China as its sort of principal adversary on the world stage. And similarly, we see China talking about America as its principal adversary on the world stage. And we see this very much through the lens of a military conflict as well as an economic and social and political one. And so within that context, China establishing a military relationship involving the potential deployment of soldiers in an island just off the American coast would clearly be seen with a concerned eye by people in Washington.
Right, saying that, so China has accused the U.S. of spreading rumors and slander with talk of a Cuba spy station. Based on your research, what should we be aware of in assessing the veracity of these reports then?
Well, I think it's very difficult to know. I think certainly the report that we saw over a week ago now, which was again in the Wall Street Journal, which suggested that there was some sort of upgrading of spy facilities happening in Cuba, and this was novel. The White House moved very quickly to scotch this story and say that actually, no, this is something that they had known about for years and had actually been reported in the open media, in fact, previously. They seem very keen to sort of shut that story down, to downplay its significance and say, well, we know that the Chinese have been operating there for some time. They've got an established relationship with the Cubans. The fact that we're seeing this military edge being added to it, I think is of concern, but I think it probably speaks more to the fact that we are seeing a really strong voice coming out of Washington at the moment in a very hawkish direction towards China. And we're seeing that expressing itself in lots of different ways. We can see it in the sort of broadsides we see against any sort of Chinese companies, against any sort of commercial interaction with China, and against sort of other countries that have relationships with China. And so I think it's really probably more an expression of the kind of domestic conversation we're seeing in the United States than a particular threat that we're seeing emerging that's particularly novel. Because certainly we haven't seen the White House or the Department of Defense rushing out to sort of, talk about these stories and elevate this particular threat. It seems to be a story that someone has been pushing out in Washington, and it probably is an expression of the very sharp conversation that we see coming out of Washington towards China.
Well, speaking of relationships that you mentioned earlier, some intelligence officials say that, Beijing is seeing its actions in Cuba as a geographical response to the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. What is your reading on this?
Well, I mean, these are two very different contexts, of course. Within a Chinese context, of course, Taiwan isn't really an independent country. They see it as part of their country. And even on the international stage, Taiwan isn't always recognized as an independent country in that way, even though it is clearly an independent political entity. Whereas Cuba is, of course, a completely independent country. So I think there is a sort of core difference that we can see within there. Within this context, of course, the simple analysis is to say that, the U.S. has recently sent some soldiers, more soldiers, to be based in Taiwan to help train the Taiwanese. The distance from Taiwan to Cuba is roughly the same as the distance from from Taiwan to the mainland is roughly the same as the distance from Cuba to the United States. So there's a very easy sort of parallelism to draw. But I would say that these are two very different sort of situations. And of course, the response by the United States will be calibrated in the same way. I think, it's worth pointing out that, of course, on the island of Cuba, the United States also has a base, the Guantanamo base, which was used to house terrorist suspects for a very long time and actually still has some in it. And it has been a long-standing sort of American intelligence base. So in a way, on Cuba, you've got both the Americans and the Chinese operating, which is not a situation that we have necessarily the same with Taiwan. So I think they are two different situations in different contexts, but I think within the global narrative we are seeing at the moment of a kind of confrontation between the US and China, it is a very simple and easy narrative to draw.
All right, well, still keeping with this relationship strain, what does this mean for efforts to improve Sino-US bilateral ties, especially given Mr. Blinken's latest visit to Beijing?
I suspect that in a way this could be an echo of that, in much the same way that, previous to when we saw Secretary Blinken planning a visit to Washington, suddenly the spy balloon story erupted and kind of completely disrupted the potential for that to happen. Clearly, there is a tension and there is a conflict going on in the intelligence and in the military sphere between the US and China. But I think the moment at which these stories tend to emerge is often linked to the sort of political calendar in a way. And so in a way, we could be seeing an echo of that here. I think what's very clear, though, is that there is clearly a desire in the White House and in the State Department and in Washington more generally, in official administration, to try to find a way of stabilizing what they describe put a bottom under the relationship with China, because they recognize that, while it is very clear that China is their sort of principal adversary on the world stage, they do need to set some parameters around this relationship and do need to set some sort of limits to where they want this confrontation to go, because they think really Washington, or China actually for that matter, doesn't really want this to escalate into a full-fledged conflict. So within that context, I think identifying each other's security moves, and this sort of mirroring the wider political conversation we see happening, I think is probably about par the course for the level of tensions that we're seeing.